My stepdaughter gave my husband a dartboard with my face as the bullseye. He laughed and said he'd hang it in the garage. I left for 3 weeks and let everything fall apart. I married my husband Glenn when his daughter Tammy was 14. I knew from the start that blending a family wouldn't be easy. Tammy's mom had left when she was 8, and Glenn raised her alone for 6 years before I came along. She was his whole world, and I respected that. I never tried to replace her mother. I never tried to discipline her or tell her what to do. I just wanted to be someone she could trust, and maybe even like eventually. I thought if I gave her enough time and space, she'd warm up to me. That was 5 years ago. Tammy is 19 now, and she hates me more than ever. From the very beginning, Tammy made it clear I wasn't welcome. She ignored me at dinner. She rolled her eyes whenever I spoke. She told Glenn I was trying too hard and it was embarrassing. Glenn always said she just needed time to adjust. When Tammy accidentally broke my grandmother's vase and didn't apologize, Glenn said she was going through a lot. When Tammy told her friends I was a gold digger even though I made more money than Glenn, he said teenagers exaggerate. When Tammy refused to come to our wedding and Glenn almost postponed it to make her happy, I should have seen the pattern. But I loved him, and I thought things would get better. They didn't. After we got married, I moved into their house. I offered to help redecorate, and Tammy threw a fit about me erasing her childhood home. I offered to drive her to school, and she said she'd rather walk 3 miles in the rain. I offered to help with college applications, and she told Glenn I was overstepping. Everything I did was wrong. Everything I didn't do was also wrong. Glenn's solution was always for me to try harder and give her more grace. I spent 5 years bending over backward for a girl who wanted me gone. I cooked her favorite meals, and she said she wasn't hungry. I bought her birthday gifts, and she left them unopened in the hall. I stayed out of her way when her friends came over, and she complained I was being weird and antisocial. Glenn never once told her to be respectful. He never once stood up for me when she was cruel. He just kept saying she'd come around when she was ready. Last month was Glenn's 50th birthday. Tammy came home from college for the weekend to celebrate. She made a big deal about having the perfect gift for him. She wrapped it herself and put a bow on top and wouldn't let anyone see it until the party. Glenn invited his siblings and some friends from work. I made all the food and decorated the whole house. Tammy didn't help with any of it, but she walked around acting like she planned the whole thing. When it was time for presents, Tammy went first. She handed Glenn this big flat box and told him she'd been working on it for months. He opened it and pulled out a custom dartboard. The bullseye was my face, not a cartoon or a joke drawing. An actual photo of me printed right in the center with the dart rings around it. Tammy laughed and said now he could finally let out his frustration. Some of Glenn's coworkers looked uncomfortable. His sister put her hand over her mouth. Glenn just stared at it for a second and then laughed. He told Tammy she was terrible and gave her a hug. He said he'd hang it in the garage. I stood there holding a tray of appetizers I'd spent 4 hours making. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody asked if I was okay. Glenn's sister came over later and whispered that Tammy was just being young and I shouldn't take it personally. I smiled and said, of course. That night, I made a decision. I was done trying. The next morning, I told Glenn I needed to visit my sister for a few weeks. He asked if everything was okay, and I said I just needed a break. He didn't push, because he never pushed when it came to my feelings. I drove to my sister's house and stayed for 3 weeks. I didn't cook. I didn't clean. I didn't manage anyone's schedule or feelings. I just existed. While I was gone, I let everything I normally handled fall apart. I was the one who paid the bills on time. I was the one who scheduled Glenn's doctor appointments. I was the one who remembered his mom's birthday and sent flowers from both of us. I was the one who kept the house running. When I stopped, everything stopped. Glenn called me after a week saying the electricity got shut off because he forgot to pay it. He called again saying he missed his dentist appointment and had to pay a cancellation fee. He called a third time saying Tammy was upset because I wasn't there to take her to get her car fixed before she drove back to campus. I told him I was busy and he could figure it out. By the time I came home, Glenn looked exhausted. The house was a mess. There was a stack of unopened mail on the counter. He asked why I didn't remind him about the bills before I left. I told him I wasn't his secretary. He asked why I was being cold. I told him I spent 5 years being warm, and it got me a dartboard with my face on it and a husband who laughed about it. I told him I was done being the only person who cared about this family working. I told him either Tammy apologized and he started standing up for me or I was leaving. Glenn stares at me like I've just spoken a different language. His mouth opens and closes without sound. I can see him trying to process what I said, and it hits me that he really thought everything would go back to normal once I came home. He thought I'd just slip back into cooking his meals and managing his life and pretending the dartboard never happened. His face shows total confusion, like he can't understand why I'm still upset about something that happened weeks ago. He finally finds his voice and asks what I mean about him standing up for me. The question makes me so tired I could cry. After 5 years of marriage, after watching his daughter treat me like dirt over and over, I'm still explaining what basic respect looks like. I tell him to sit down because we're doing this now. Not later when he's had time to think up excuses or talk to Tammy about what to say. Right now, while everything is still raw and real. Glenn sits on the couch looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I stay standing because sitting feels too casual for this conversation. I start walking him through the past 5 years, incident by incident. I remind him about the vase my grandmother gave me that Tammy broke and never apologized for. He opens his mouth and I know he's about to say she was going through a lot, so I keep talking. I tell him about her calling me a gold digger to her friends, even though I make more money than he does. About her refusing to come to our wedding and how he almost postponed it to make her happy. About every single time she was cruel, and he asked me to be more understanding. Glenn tries to interrupt with his usual justifications, but I hold up my hand. I tell him he needs to just listen for once instead of defending her or making excuses. My voice stays calm, but my hand shakes a little. I describe what it felt like to watch him almost cancel our wedding for a teenager throwing a fit. What it felt like to be called names and have him tell me she was just exaggerating. What it felt like to have my face printed on a dartboard as a joke gift, and watch him laugh and hug her like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. When I finish, Glenn looks genuinely shaken. He says he never realized it was that bad. The anger that spikes through me is so sharp I have to take a breath before I respond. That's exactly the problem. He never realized because he never paid attention. He never made my feelings as important as Tammy's tantrums. For 5 years, I've been telling him how much her behavior hurts, and he's been telling me to give her more time, be more patient, try harder. He never once stopped to think about what he was asking me to endure. Glenn asks what I want him to do, and his voice sounds small. I tell him Tammy needs to apologize for the dartboard and acknowledge that she's been treating me badly. Not just a quick sorry to make things smooth over. A real apology where she admits what she did was wrong, and he needs to set boundaries with her about treating me with basic courtesy. Not asking me to be more understanding or giving her more grace. Actually enforcing rules about respect in our home. Glenn says Tammy is stubborn and getting an apology might take time. I tell him he has 2 weeks before I start looking for my own apartment. His face goes pale and he asks if I'm serious about leaving. I tell him I have never been more serious about anything in my entire life. I spent 5 years bending myself into shapes trying to make this family work while he did nothing. I'm done being the only person who cares if this marriage survives. The next morning, Glenn is quiet and distracted. He tries to make eggs but burns them because he keeps staring at nothing. I pour myself cereal and eat standing at the counter. The burned smell fills the kitchen, but neither of us mentions it. I grab my bag and head to work early because staying in that house feels suffocating. At my desk, I try to focus on emails, but my mind keeps replaying last night's conversation. Mandy shows up at my cubicle before lunch and takes one look at my face. She doesn't ask if I'm okay. She just says we're taking a break and walks me to the break room. Once the door closes, she sits across from me and waits. I tell her about the ultimatum and expect her to say I'm being too harsh or that marriage takes work. Instead, she surprises me by saying it's about time I stood up for myself. She's watched me make excuses for Glenn's enabling for years. She was starting to wonder if I'd ever reach my limit. That evening, I'm in the bedroom folding laundry when I hear Glenn's voice from the living room. He's calling Tammy and his tone is uncomfortable and halting. I can hear him trying to explain that things need to change, but he keeps stumbling over his words. Then Tammy's voice comes through the phone speaker loud and sharp. She's asking why he's suddenly siding with her over his own daughter. Her voice drips with accusation and disbelief. The call doesn't last long. I hear Tammy's voice get louder and then there's silence. Glenn appears in the bedroom doorway looking defeated. He says Tammy hung up on him. She won't even consider apologizing and thinks I'm manipulating him into choosing me over her. I set down the shirt I'm folding and ask him point blank whose perception he trusts more after 5 years of marriage. Does he trust his daughter who's been hostile since day one, or his wife who's done nothing but try to make this family work? Glenn sits on the edge of the couch rubbing his face with both hands. He looks up at me with tired eyes and says he knows Tammy has been difficult. He tells me she went through a lot when her mom left. I feel my jaw tighten because I've heard this excuse for 5 years straight. I tell him trauma doesn't give anyone permission to be cruel. Plenty of people experience abandonment without turning into bullies who make dartboards with people's faces on them. I'm done accepting bad behavior just because she has a sad backstory. Glenn opens his mouth like he wants to argue, but nothing comes out. He looks down at his hands and nods slowly. The conversation ends there because neither of us has energy left to keep fighting. The next 2 days feel like living with a stranger. Glenn starts sentences at breakfast, then trails off halfway through. He picks up his phone to text me something, then sets it back down. I catch him staring at nothing while the coffee maker beeps. The tension sits thick between us like humidity before a storm. I go to work and come home and we move around each other carefully. On the third morning, Glenn finds me in the kitchen before I leave for my shift. He asks if we can see a marriage counselor together. His voice sounds small and uncertain. I tell him yes, but the 2-week deadline still stands. He nods and pulls out his phone to start searching for available appointments. Glenn gets us scheduled with a counselor for the following week. I mark it on my calendar and try not to think about what happens if it doesn't help. 3 days later, I'm folding laundry in the bedroom when my phone rings. Rachel's name shows on the screen. I answer and she asks if I have a minute to talk. Her voice sounds serious and a little nervous. I sit down on the bed and tell her I'm listening. Rachel says she's been thinking about the birthday party. She tells me she feels guilty for not speaking up when she saw the dartboard. She watched me standing there holding that tray of food, and she didn't say a word. The guilt has been eating at her ever since. Rachel tells me she's watched Tammy treat me badly for years. She always assumed Glenn was handling it privately behind closed doors. She thought maybe he was having conversations with Tammy that she just didn't see. Now she realizes he wasn't handling it at all. She says what Tammy did was cruel, and Glenn's response was completely unacceptable. Hearing someone from his family finally acknowledge it makes something loosen in my chest. I didn't realize how much I needed someone else to see what I've been living with. Rachel's voice gets firmer and she says she wants me to know that I didn't deserve any of it. I thank Rachel for calling and for being honest. She asks if there's anything she can do to help fix this mess. I think about it for a minute, then tell her the truth. Glenn needs to hear from his family that enabling Tammy isn't protecting her. It's teaching her that disrespecting people has no consequences. It's showing her she can treat people like garbage and her dad will make excuses for her. Rachel goes quiet for a second, then says she understands. She promises to talk to Glenn soon. We hang up and I finish folding the laundry feeling slightly less alone than I did an hour ago. 2 days pass and Glenn mentions casually that his sister called him. He's washing dishes and won't look at me when he says it. He tells me Rachel said he's been a bad husband. His hands stop moving in the soapy water. He admits he didn't realize other people saw the problem too. He thought maybe I was being too sensitive or taking things too personally, but Rachel told him she's been uncomfortable watching it for years. Glenn sets down the plate he's holding and grips the edge of the sink. He looks genuinely shaken, like the ground shifted under his feet. The first counseling session arrives and we sit on opposite ends of the couch in the therapist's office. The room smells like lavender and has paintings of beaches on the walls. The counselor is a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She asks us to describe why we're there. Glenn goes first and gives this cleaned-up version about communication issues and blended family challenges. He uses words like adjustment period and different expectations. I feel my jaw tighten listening to him make it sound so neutral and manageable. He's making it sound like we just need to learn to talk better. When the counselor turns to me, I don't sugarcoat anything. I lay out the facts in plain language. 5 years of disrespect from his daughter. No protection from my husband during any of it. A dartboard with my face on it that he found funny enough to laugh at. I tell her about the broken vase and the gold digger comments and the almost postponed wedding. The counselor's expression shifts from neutral to concerned. She looks at Glenn and asks if what I'm saying is accurate. He shifts uncomfortably and admits yes, it's all true. The room goes quiet except for the sound of the air conditioner humming. Glenn tries to explain that he thought he was keeping the peace. He didn't want to make Tammy feel like she had to choose between him and me. He thought if he stayed neutral and gave her time, she'd eventually come around on her own. The counselor lets him finish, then asks how well that strategy worked. Glenn goes completely silent. He stares at his hands in his lap. The answer hangs in the air between us, obvious and unavoidable. It failed completely, and we all know it. The counselor writes something in her notebook, and the sound of her pen scratching feels loud. The counselor gives us homework before we leave. Glenn needs to write down every incident he can remember where he chose avoiding conflict over supporting me. I need to write down what I actually need from him going forward. She tells us change will be uncomfortable and slow, but staying in the old pattern guarantees this marriage will fail. We walk to the car in complete silence. Glenn looks like someone hit him with a truck. He sits in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine. Neither of us speaks the entire drive home. 3 days pass and I'm wiping down the kitchen counter when I hear a key turn in the front door. My stomach drops because Glenn is at work and only one other person has a key. Tammy walks in like she still lives here. She doesn't knock. She doesn't call first. She just appears in the doorway between the hall and kitchen with her arms crossed and her jaw set. I put down the dish towel and turn to face her. She looks angry. Her eyes are hard and her mouth is pressed into a thin line. I can feel my heart start to pound, but I keep my face neutral. She wants to know what I said to her dad to turn him against her. Her voice is sharp and accusing. I take a breath and tell her calmly that I asked for basic respect after 5 years of hostility. That's all. No manipulation, no lies. Just the truth about how she's treated me. Tammy scoffs and rolls her eyes. She says I'm being overdramatic. That word again. The same word Glenn used to use before he finally started listening. I feel my carefully maintained calm start to crack around the edges. My hands are shaking, so I grip the counter behind me. I tell her she can dismiss my feelings all she wants, but her father is finally seeing the pattern. He's finally noticing the cruelty she's shown me for 5 years straight. Tammy steps closer and gets right in my face. She's taller than me, and she uses that now. She tells me I'm not her mother and I never will be. Her breath is hot and her voice is loud. I don't back away even though everything in me wants to step back. I tell her I never wanted to be her mother. I never tried to replace anyone. I just wanted not to be treated like garbage in my own home. Is that really too much to ask? Tammy's face twists and she turns away. She grabs her keys off the counter where she threw them and heads for the door. She slams it hard enough that the frame rattles. I stand in the kitchen shaking. My legs feel weak, so I sink into one of the chairs at the table. I press my palms flat against the wood surface and try to slow my breathing. The house is silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. An hour later, Glenn comes home and finds me still sitting at the kitchen table. He asks what's wrong, and I tell him what happened. I describe Tammy walking in unannounced. I tell him about her getting in my face. I repeat what she said about not being her mother. Glenn's expression changes while I talk. His jaw tightens and his eyes go dark. For the first time since I've known him, he looks genuinely angry at his daughter instead of making excuses for her behavior. He pulls out his phone. Glenn calls Tammy right there in the kitchen while I'm still sitting at the table. I can hear her voice through the phone even though he doesn't have her on speaker. She's yelling immediately. Glenn tells her she's not allowed to come to the house and ambush me anymore. His voice is firm in a way I've never heard before. Tammy screams that I've poisoned him against her, that I'm manipulating him, that he's choosing his wife over his own daughter. Glenn stays firm. He says until she can be respectful, her visits need to be scheduled when he's home. No more surprise appearances, no more confrontations. Tammy hangs up on him. Glenn sets his phone down on the table and sits heavily in the chair across from me. He looks exhausted. He runs both hands through his hair and stares at the table. He tells me he never saw how bad it was because Tammy was usually on her best behavior around him. She saved her worst moments for when he wasn't there. I tell him that's exactly the problem. She knew how to manipulate the situation. She knew how to make me look like the sensitive one who couldn't handle a teenager. And he never questioned why I was always the problem. He just believed her version of events. The second counseling session happens 4 days later. Glenn brings his list of incidents where he failed to support me. The counselor asks him to read it out loud. Glenn's voice shakes as he goes through each item. The broken vase, the gold digger comments, the almost postponed wedding, the dartboard. All the times he told me to give Tammy more grace instead of telling Tammy to show basic respect. Reading it out loud clearly pains him. His face is red and he can't look at me while he talks. The counselor asks how it feels to see the pattern written down in black and white. Glenn admits he's ashamed. He says he told himself he was protecting Tammy from more loss, but he sees now that he was just avoiding difficult conversations. The counselor nods and points out that avoiding conflict doesn't make it disappear. It just teaches people that bad behavior works. I share my list of what I need going forward. Public acknowledgement that Tammy's behavior was wrong. Consistent enforcement of respectful boundaries. Glenn actively defending me instead of staying neutral when Tammy attacks. No more asking me to understand her pain while ignoring mine. The counselor asks if these seem reasonable to Glenn. He nods, but he looks overwhelmed, like he's realizing how much work this will actually take. The counselor writes something in her notebook. She assigns us new homework before we leave. Glenn needs to have a serious conversation with Tammy about consequences. Real consequences that actually matter, and I need to identify what accountability looks like for me. What am I willing to do differently? What boundaries do I need to set for myself? The counselor warns us that change will be slow and uncomfortable. Progress won't be linear. There will be setbacks and hard days. But staying in the old pattern guarantees this marriage will fail. We have to decide if we're willing to do the work, or if we're just going through the motions. Glenn reaches for my hand as we walk to the car. I let him take it. That night, Glenn's phone rings while we're getting ready for bed. I hear him answer, and his voice shifts into that careful tone he uses with family. He walks into the hallway, and I catch fragments through the door. His brother Kevin's name comes up. Their mom is upset, apparently. Glenn explains the whole situation in more detail than I've heard him use before. The dartboard, the years of disrespect, how close I came to leaving. His voice gets stronger as he talks, like saying it out loud makes it more real. Then he goes quiet, and I hear him say he didn't expect that response. When he comes back into the bedroom, his face looks different. Lighter, somehow. He sits on the edge of the bed and tells me Kevin said it's about time he stood up for me. Kevin apparently watched Tammy act entitled for years and wondered when someone would finally set boundaries. Glenn seems almost shocked that his brother noticed. Kevin pointed out something else too. Their mom babied Glenn the same way Glenn babies Tammy. Maybe it's a pattern that runs in the family, a cycle that needs breaking. Glenn stares at his hands while he tells me this. I can see the words hitting him hard. He says he's starting to realize how many people saw the problem while he stayed blind to it. His brother, his sister, his coworkers. Everyone noticed except him. I tell him awareness is just the first step. What matters now is sustained action over time. Anyone can feel bad and make promises. Following through when it's hard is what counts. The next week, Glenn does something I've never seen before. He checks in with me every single day about how I'm feeling. Not surface-level stuff either. Real questions about whether I felt supported or dismissed. When I mention past hurts, he doesn't make excuses or try to explain them away. He just listens. Actually listens instead of preparing his defense while I talk. On Wednesday, I bring up the time Tammy told her friends I was a gold digger, and he didn't correct her. In the past, he would have said she was just venting or I was being too sensitive. This time he says he should have shut that down immediately, and he's sorry he didn't. On Friday, I mention how alone I felt at his birthday party standing there with that dartboard and nobody saying anything. He closes his eyes and nods. Says he can't imagine how that must have felt, and he wishes he could go back and handle it differently. The change is so big, I almost don't trust it. 5 years of one pattern and now suddenly this. Part of me keeps waiting for him to slip back into old habits. Our third counseling session happens the following Tuesday. The counselor asks how the week went, and Glenn talks about the homework he did, the conversations we had, how hard it was to hear about all the times he failed me, but how necessary it felt. Then the counselor turns to me and asks what I'm feeling. I sit there for a minute trying to find the right words. Finally, I admit that I'm scared to believe the change is real. I've been disappointed so many times. Every time I thought things might get better, Tammy would do something cruel, and Glenn would make excuses, and I'd be right back where I started. The counselor nods like she expected this. She asks what would help me feel safer. I think about it. Really think. And I realize I need to see Glenn handle Tammy's next outburst without caving. I need to watch him hold a boundary when she's angry and pushing back. That's the real test. Anyone can be supportive when things are calm. Standing firm when your kid is furious at you is different. That test comes sooner than I expected. Glenn's phone buzzes during dinner 2 days later. He glances at it and his face goes tight. He shows me the screen. A text from Tammy, long and angry, demanding he choose between his daughter and his wife. Saying he's changed and she doesn't recognize him anymore. Accusing me of turning him against her. Glenn looks at me and asks how I think he should respond. I'm genuinely surprised. He's asking my input instead of just reacting. We sit at the kitchen table with his phone between us. I suggest he needs to be clear that he loves her, but won't accept disrespect toward me. That her behavior has consequences, including reduced contact until she can be civil. Glenn types slowly. His hand shakes a little as he crafts the message. He reads it out loud to make sure it says what he means. Then he hovers over the send button for a few seconds before pressing it. I watch his face. He looks scared but determined. Tammy responds almost immediately. A flood of texts, one after another, calling him brainwashed, calling me manipulative, saying I've destroyed their relationship, that he's choosing some woman over his own daughter. Glenn reads each one and I can see how much they hurt. His jaw clenches. His eyes get wet. But instead of backtracking or trying to smooth things over, he does something I've never seen. He turns off his phone, just powers it down completely. He sets it on the counter and looks at me. Says he needs to stop rewarding her tantrums with immediate attention. That giving her what she wants every time she gets angry just teaches her the behavior works. I feel something shift in my chest. Relief, maybe. Or hope. He's actually doing it. He's holding the boundary even though it's killing him. The next day, Glenn goes to work, and apparently his coworker Harold pulls him aside. Harold was at the birthday party. Saw the whole dartboard thing. He tells Glenn he's glad to hear Glenn is addressing the situation. Says he went home that night and told his wife it was one of the most uncomfortable gifts he'd ever witnessed. That he felt bad for me standing there while everyone pretended it was funny. Harold apparently didn't know what to say at the time, but the whole thing stuck with him. Glenn comes home and tells me about the conversation. I can see it's another piece of evidence clicking into place. He wasn't overreacting by laughing it off. Other people saw how wrong it was too. People who have no reason to take sides or make things up. They witnessed it and felt uncomfortable and went home thinking about how awful it was. Glenn apologizes again for his response that night. But this time it feels different, like he truly understands why it hurt instead of just saying sorry because he knows he should. He gets it now. Finally gets it. The 2-week deadline I gave Glenn came and went without any apology from Tammy. I sat at the kitchen table on day 14, watching him cook dinner with actual effort instead of his usual half-attention routine. He checked in with me 3 times during the meal prep, asking if I needed anything or if he could help with something I was doing. Small things, but consistent. He hadn't defended himself once when I mentioned feeling hurt. He hadn't made a single excuse for Tammy's behavior. He just listened and acknowledged and changed his actions. I told him that night I'd stay and keep trying, but I made it clear I was watching. One slip back into old patterns, and I was done. He nodded and said he understood, and I could see the relief in his face mixed with something that looked like determination. Glenn surprised me the next morning by suggesting we set up regular check-ins. He wanted scheduled times where I could tell him honestly if I was feeling unsupported, not just when things got bad enough that I had to bring it up. It seemed like such a small thing, but it showed me he was thinking about maintaining change over time instead of just putting out the current fire. Most people would have relaxed once the immediate crisis passed. Glenn was planning ahead to prevent backsliding. I agreed to weekly check-ins on Sunday evenings, and he put it in his phone calendar right there in front of me. Tammy went silent after Glenn's last message to her. 2 weeks passed with no response to his texts. I watched it eat at him. He checked his phone constantly. He stared at it during dinner. He mentioned her name and then stopped himself. One night he said maybe he should drive to her campus just to make sure she was okay. I reminded him that she was using silence as punishment, trying to make him panic enough to chase her and apologize for setting boundaries. If he went running to her now, he'd teach her the tactic worked. She'd use it every time she wanted to manipulate him. Glenn looked like I'd punched him in the stomach, but he put his phone down and didn't bring up the campus visit again. I could see him struggling with it over the next few days. He'd pick up his phone, start typing a message, then delete it and set the phone aside. He'd mention wanting to call her, then catch himself. It was hard to watch because I knew how much it hurt him, but I also knew this was necessary. Tammy needed to learn that throwing tantrums didn't get her what she wanted anymore. Finally, after 2 full weeks of silence, his phone buzzed during breakfast. Tammy had sent a short text saying she was fine but needed space. Not warm, not apologetic, but it was communication. Glenn read it 3 times and showed it to me with something like hope in his eyes. I told him it was a good sign she wasn't completely cutting him off. He nodded and sent back a simple message saying he understood, and he loved her. Our 5th counseling session happened 3 days later. The therapist asked about our intimate relationship, which had been completely dead since the dartboard incident. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Glenn admitted he'd been afraid to initiate anything because he didn't know where we stood. He looked at me when he said it, and I could see the uncertainty in his face. I told the therapist I needed emotional safety before physical closeness felt possible. I couldn't be vulnerable with someone who didn't protect me. The words came out matter of fact, but Glenn flinched like I'd hit him. The therapist nodded and said that made perfect sense given everything that had happened. We spent the rest of the session talking about rebuilding trust in small steps. The counselor suggested starting with non-sexual physical affection, holding hands, hugging, sitting close on the couch. Things that showed care without pressure for more. It felt awkward when she said it, like we were teenagers who didn't know how to date yet. But Glenn agreed immediately and asked if he could hold my hand right then. I let him and his palm was sweaty against mine. That night we sat together watching TV and he put his arm around my shoulders. It felt strange after weeks of careful distance, but also like something I'd been missing without realizing it. Dawn called me a few days later to check in. I told her about Glenn's sustained effort and the counseling sessions and the small physical affection we were rebuilding. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she was cautiously optimistic. Then she reminded me that people can maintain new behavior for a few weeks and then slip back into old patterns. Real change takes months of consistency to prove itself. She wasn't trying to be negative, just realistic. She'd seen me hurt before and she wanted me to protect myself. I appreciated it even though part of me wanted her to just be happy things were improving. I told Glenn that night what Dawn had said. We were sitting on the couch and his arm was around me and I told him we were still in the early stages of rebuilding. That a few weeks of good behavior didn't erase 5 years of him failing to stand up for me. Glenn pulled back slightly so he could look at my face and he said he understood he was earning back trust, not owed it. That response alone showed growth. The old Glenn would have gotten defensive or asked how long I was going to hold the past against him. This Glenn accepted that trust was broken and had to be rebuilt brick by brick. Mandy noticed at work the next week that I seemed different. Less tense, less like I was carrying weight on my shoulders all the time. She asked if things were improving at home and I told her about Glenn's consistent effort and the counseling. Mandy said she was glad but then reminded me to keep my exit plan ready just in case. She'd watched too many friends get hopeful about change only to have their partners revert once the immediate threat of consequences passed. I told her I was keeping my separate bank account funded and my important documents in one place. I wasn't naive enough to think the work was done. I appreciated Mandy's protectiveness more than she probably knew. Her words reminded me to maintain my financial independence and emotional boundaries, even while giving Glenn a real chance. I was willing to stay and see if the changes stuck, willing to rebuild what we'd broken, willing to hope we could have something better than what we had before. But I wasn't going back to being the person who accepted crumbs and called it a meal. I wasn't going back to bending myself into shapes to avoid conflict. I wasn't going back to being invisible in my own marriage. Glenn was doing the work now, and I'd keep watching to see if it lasted, but I'd also keep my escape route clear just in case it didn't. Glenn's phone rang 3 days later while we were making dinner together. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted. He mouthed "my mom" to me, and I nodded, stepping back to give him space but staying close enough to hear. He answered and put it on speaker without her knowing. His mom's voice came through sharp and accusing, asking why he was being so hard on Tammy over one little joke. Glenn took a breath and I watched his jaw tighten. He told her it wasn't one joke. It was 5 years of cruelty that he ignored. His mom sputtered something about family loyalty and how blood comes first. Glenn interrupted her, something I'd never heard him do before. He said his wife was his family too, and he'd failed her for 5 years by not standing up for her. His mom went quiet for a second, then started talking about how Tammy lost her mother and needed understanding. Glenn said Tammy's trauma didn't give her permission to abuse someone who'd only tried to care about her. The call ended badly with his mom saying she needed time to think about all this. Glenn set his phone down on the counter and his hands were shaking slightly. After the call ended, Glenn leaned against the counter looking completely drained. He ran both hands through his hair and let out a long breath. I walked over and put my hand on his arm. He looked at me and said standing up to his mom was harder than he'd expected. I told him I was proud of him and I meant every word. He was doing the difficult work of changing patterns that had existed his whole life. His mom had always babied him the same way he'd babied Tammy, and breaking that cycle took real courage. Glenn pulled me into a hug and held on tight. We stood there in the kitchen with the half-chopped vegetables on the cutting board, and I felt something shift between us. This wasn't the man who'd laughed at a dartboard with my face on it. This was someone fighting to become better. 2 months passed with Glenn maintaining the changes he'd started. He checked in with me daily about how I felt. He went to counseling without complaining. He enforced boundaries with Tammy even when it clearly hurt him. Then one Tuesday morning, his phone buzzed with a text from Tammy asking if they could meet for coffee. Glenn showed me the message immediately instead of hiding it or handling it alone. He asked if I was comfortable with him meeting her. I told him yes, but reminded him that he needed to maintain the boundaries we'd established together. Tammy didn't get to walk back into his life and pretend nothing had changed. Glenn nodded and texted back that he could meet her Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop near her campus. I watched him type the message and felt anxious, but also relieved that he was asking my input instead of just doing whatever Tammy wanted. Saturday came and Glenn left mid-morning for the 2-hour drive to Tammy's college town. I tried to distract myself with errands and cleaning but kept checking my phone. He was gone for 5 hours total, and when he walked back in, I was sitting on the couch pretending to read. Glenn sat down next to me and said the conversation had been hard. Tammy didn't apologize for the dartboard or any of the other cruel things she'd done over the years. But she did admit for the first time that she'd been angry at him for remarrying. She said she felt like he'd replaced her mom, and that bringing me into their house had ruined the family they'd built together. It wasn't the accountability I'd wanted to hear. It wasn't her taking responsibility for her actions. But it was the first time she'd acknowledged any motivation beyond just being mean for the sake of it. Glenn looked exhausted and sad. He said he'd told Tammy that her anger was understandable, but her cruelty wasn't, and that he should have addressed it years ago instead of making excuses. Our next counseling session happened 3 days after Glenn's coffee meeting with Tammy. I told the counselor what Tammy had said about being angry over the remarriage. The counselor nodded slowly and said, understanding Tammy's anger didn't excuse her cruelty, but it might open a path to future change. She warned us that Tammy's progress would likely be much slower than Glenn's. Tammy hadn't hit rock bottom the way Glenn had when I'd given my ultimatum. She hadn't faced real consequences that forced her to look at her behavior. The counselor asked us what minimum behavior we'd accept from Tammy going forward. Glenn and I looked at each other and I could see he wanted me to answer first. I said Tammy didn't have to love me or see me as family, but she did have to be basically polite and stop actively trying to hurt me. Glenn agreed and added that he'd enforce that standard even if it meant limiting contact with his daughter. The counselor made us both commit out loud to those boundaries. Glenn and I spent the next week talking through what basic politeness actually meant in practice. No more insults, direct or indirect. No more cruel gifts or comments. No more showing up at our house to ambush me when he wasn't home. If Tammy couldn't manage those simple things, then she wouldn't be welcome in our lives until she could. Glenn struggled with the idea of potentially cutting off his daughter, but he acknowledged that enabling her hadn't helped anyone. I committed to not expecting more from Tammy than she could genuinely give. I wasn't going to push for warmth or affection or a relationship beyond basic civility. If that's all she could manage, then that's what we'd accept. The counselor had reminded us that some people never change, and we needed to be prepared for that possibility. But we also needed to leave the door open for growth if Tammy ever chose to walk through it. 3 months after the dartboard incident, Glenn suggested we host a small dinner with just Rachel and Kevin. He said he wanted to show his family that we were working through things and that our marriage was stronger than it had been. I felt nervous about the idea, but agreed. Glenn promised he'd shut down any criticism of me immediately, and that the dinner would end the second anyone made me uncomfortable. We set the date for the following Saturday, and I spent the week anxious about it. Rachel and Kevin arrived right on time bringing wine and flowers. The dinner started awkwardly with everyone being overly polite. But as the evening went on, the conversation relaxed. We talked about work and Rachel's kids and Kevin's new house. Nobody mentioned Tammy or the dartboard until dessert when Rachel brought it up herself. Rachel said she was glad to see Glenn finally acting like a husband should. Glenn didn't get defensive or make excuses. He agreed and thanked her for the wake-up call she'd given him after the birthday party. Kevin added that he'd told Glenn the same thing and was relieved to see real change happening. The conversation shifted to Glenn's growth and the work we'd been doing in counseling. I sat there listening to Glenn talk openly about his failures and his commitment to doing better. This was so different from the man who'd asked why I didn't remind him about the bills before I left. Rachel hugged me when they were leaving and whispered that she was proud of me for standing up for myself. Kevin shook Glenn's hand and told him not to backslide. After they left, Glenn and I cleaned up the kitchen together, and he said that had gone better than he'd feared. The following Monday at work, Mandy pulled me aside during lunch break. She said I seemed like a completely different person than I'd been 3 months ago. I asked what she meant, and she said I wasn't tense all the time anymore. I wasn't walking on eggshells or looking stressed every time my phone buzzed. I wasn't swallowing hurt and pretending everything was fine. Mandy said having a partner who actually had my back had changed everything about how safe I felt. I realized she was right. For 5 years, I'd carried constant anxiety about the next cruel thing Tammy would do, and whether Glenn would defend me. Now I knew Glenn would stand up for me even when it was hard. That security made me feel lighter in ways I hadn't even recognized I'd been missing. Mandy squeezed my hand and said she was happy for me, but also proud that I'd demanded better for myself. Our 5th anniversary fell on a Thursday, and Glenn suggested we celebrate quietly at home instead of going out. He cooked dinner himself, something he'd been doing more often as part of taking on household responsibilities. After we ate, he handed me a wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo of us from our wedding day, both of us smiling and hopeful. Glenn said he was sorry it had taken almost losing me to become the husband I deserved from the start. I looked at the photo and then at him, and told him what mattered was that he was doing the work now. We weren't the same people we'd been 5 years ago, and our marriage wasn't the same either. We were building something new based on mutual respect and partnership. It wasn't perfect, and Tammy's shadow still hung over us. But Glenn was showing up for me consistently, and that made all the difference. We spent the rest of the evening on the couch talking about the future and what we wanted our marriage to look like going forward. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful that we could make it work. A week later, my phone buzzed while I was at work sorting through spreadsheets. The screen showed a text from Tammy. I stared at it for a solid minute before opening the message. It said, "I'm sorry about the dartboard. It was mean." That was it. No explanation about why she did it or acknowledgement of the 5 years before that moment. No attempt to justify her behavior or make excuses. Just those 8 words admitting she'd done something wrong. I read it 3 times sitting at my desk while Mandy walked past and asked if I was okay. I told her I'd explain later and saved the screenshot before closing my phone. That evening, I showed Glenn the text when he got home from work. His whole face changed and he looked relieved in a way I hadn't seen in months. He asked what I was going to say back and I told him I needed time to think about it. He nodded and didn't push me for an immediate response or try to convince me to forgive everything right away. I spent that night thinking about what I wanted from this moment. The next day, I typed out a reply that said, "Thank you for saying that," and hit send before I could overthink it. It wasn't warm and it wasn't an invitation for more conversation, but it acknowledged that she'd made an effort. Our final scheduled counseling session happened on Thursday afternoon. The therapist asked where we saw ourselves going forward now that we'd been working together for 3 months. Glenn said he wanted to keep being present and protective instead of sliding back into old patterns. I told her I felt cautiously hopeful that we could build something healthier than what we'd had before. She reminded us that change was ongoing work, and not a destination we'd arrive at and be finished. We left that office knowing we were on our own now without the weekly accountability. The months that followed weren't perfect, and Tammy didn't suddenly become warm toward me. But Glenn chose our marriage consistently when it mattered. He enforced boundaries with his daughter without me having to ask. He stood up for me in small moments and big ones. Some damage from those 5 years would probably always remain like cracks in a foundation that got repaired, but never fully disappeared. We were building new patterns based on mutual respect instead of me bending until I broke. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I had a true partner who actually saw me and valued me enough to fight for us.